If you have ever felt that it is impossible to leave a relationship, regardless of how much pain that it causes you, there's a good chance that you're in a trauma bond. And that can come in many areas of relationships. And that's what we're going to talk about today, trauma bonds. Check it out. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Positivity Experience. It is your girl, Lori, and man, am I excited that you are here. Happy February. It's insane to me. I know. And I'm so excited to tell you that the workbook is free and it is live, and you will have a link to that here in the show notes, or you can just go to my website and get it. And I'm going to have some other workbooks coming your way. Some will be paid. Not all are going to be free. And I have some new things coming up, and I'm really excited to share them with you. You know, you kind of get to a place where you're like, okay, not that you're bored, but you're like, I want to give more information, but it's also good for yourself to change it up, because we get caught in these ruts. So there is always going to be a worksheet that will be paired with this podcast. And this worksheet that I have is going to very much be helpful for you as you're navigating through trauma bonds. And we're going to spend a little time on them. And I'm going to share some stories with you, or one big story where I realized my trauma bonds. And we're just going to go deep into it, because this is something that's been requested multiple times, but this is where I put it in. And next week is actually going to be on emotional labor. So you'll kind of see how these two things go hand in hand. But yes, if you want that worksheet, just pop over to Patreon, patreon.com/the positivity experience. Or again, you'll have the link in the show notes. That is the description. So if you're wondering where that is. So let's discuss what a trauma bond is. Because, you know, everybody says trauma bonding, can't get away from this. You know, we use these words, narcissism, we use these words, ego, we use these words, boundaries, but that is really, they're just describer words. It's what actions are you going to take beneath that, right? And trauma bonds are intense emotional attachments. And that is formed between any type of a relationship. It isn't just about family dynamics. It can be friendships, but that is included even in toxic relationships. And that's a result of so many things, but it's this weird reinforcement. There's a reward versus a punishment. And that was coined actually by Patrick Kahns, I believe his name is. And that's his work in betrayal bonds. But this goes in multiple ways. And, you know, I was going to tell you the story now, but I'll pop it in here because I'm like, it's fresh in my head. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast is as I'm writing my book, this was a big thing. I was like, oh my God, I haven't talked to them about this yet. So let's talk about that. So it's common in abusive relationships, romantic, parent-child relationships, workplace, and friendships. I know you're like, well, hell, I'm screwed. Well, yeah, because anything that has interpersonal skills where you have to have communication, or you're relying on things for safety and security, you know, those are all those things that kind of create so much. And there's so many reasons as to why these things are created and why they are so deeply ingrained in us. And remember that your brain has neuroplasticity, right? So think of it as, I don't know, like Play-Doh, but Play-Doh with different lines coming out of it. And just because the trauma has affected your brain, and it does, right? Trauma can, you know, rewire the brain, does not mean that you can't rewire it back and you can overwrite that story. It does exist. It's just, you're going to have to be in this for the long haul. And, you know, sometimes you realize it's a trauma bond, but it's become a normal part of your life. So you know it's a trauma bond, but then you talk yourself into kind of staying in it. Like, well, you know what? Like, it's okay. Like, it's not all bad, right? Now you start talking yourself out of it. And when you've been so used to trauma bonding most of your life, it's normal, but you don't like it. And it feels weird, but it feels familiar. Because remember, a lot of times we stay in our own chaos, regardless of what that is, with or without trauma bonding, because we are familiar with it. We are used to it. Didn't mean that it's good for you. Doesn't mean that it's the best thing for your health, but it is consistent within something that we know how to deal with. Then if you throw in attachment, well, that is going to be a massive part of trauma bonding, is attachments. They are ideas of what you think life is supposed to look like and what the feeling of relationships are supposed to be. You know, I think we have this, you've heard me talk about this before. We have this idea of what life should look like. Now, it's not as bad on TV and movies as it used to be, but it was very one-dimensional. You wait for the prince to come and save the princess. The guy goes out and he forages for food, and the woman stays home and cleans the house, and you can't be without this person because this is a family unit, and this is how it's got to be. So, a lot of things that we see socially or even culturally has started to create this level of a trauma bond. Then you throw in the side of the attachments and feeling of abandonment and rejection, which again, I promise you that you can work through that. That is what I help my clients with. Oh, and somebody asked me, how could you become a client? It's right on my website. Just side note, somebody asked. And it's so, so important because common in abusive relationships, and I want to talk to you about that. And again, believe it or not, sometimes we think that that's normal because of how we grew up. Now, it might not be physical, but it can be emotional. And it's a reward based in a punishment. So there's a cycle of abuse and reconciliation. Abuse, reconciliation. So think of it as your fishing, like a fishing line. Okay. And the abuse is, you are not good. You are nothing without me. Absolutely not. I'm going to break you. Okay. So then you're like, this is not good. This is not good. So you're throw out your fishing line. So it's like way over there. It's like in the middle of the water. And you're like, oh my God, why? First of all, why I'm in the middle of this water? And second of all, maybe I can't be in this relationship. But wait a minute. That's where we're going to reel you back in. Now we've caught the fish because we're going to give you this. I'm so sorry. I can't believe that this happened. This will never happen again. And you know what? Sometimes it's not about the abuse. Sometimes it was like a poor choice or something like that. It's very different than abuse. And people do make poor choices in their life. So you can't always persecute somebody based on that. That's different than the abusive relationship. But what you're going to see is abuse, reconciliation, emotional highs. Oh my God, this is great. Best relationship I've ever had. Best friendships I've ever had. And then the lows. Well, that creates dependency. Highs and lows. So when you're in the low, you're dependent upon this situation or this person who has made you high. So remember, you're like, oh my God, I don't like this. I want this again. And then if you put the fear of abandonment paired with hope for change, oh my God, this is a big one. Hope for change is what is going to screw you at every turn. Now, I didn't say be hopeful in your life. I can make changes. I can do that. I have hope for becoming a better version of myself. Love that. Hope for change is a massive part of insecurity. It's also a massive part of trauma bonding. I know that they can change. I want them to change. It used to be this way. This used to be this way. It can go back to that. And because of that, especially if you're in a trauma bond, again, a little bit different from narcissism. Okay, not trauma bonding isn't just about narcissism. It's just about an enmeshment. If you go back to the podcast I did just a few weeks ago, especially if you're on Patreon, go back and grab that worksheet. But look at that and look at enmeshment and then look at trauma bonding, and it's going to be very similar. They kind of marry each other. They're like siblings. But if you keep falling in love with hope for change, you will constantly be chasing that relationship based on either the idea you have of it or what you remember it to be. Stop carrying hope for change. Be hopeful within yourself. Be hopeful knowing, hey, I can make these changes. I can get out of this relationship. Hope, great. Hope for change in somebody else? No, not great. Not great. And then you have to say, why am I not accepting this? Because you are attaching some value of love or validity or validation to said person or said situation. Now, there's an actual scientific definition. Yep, there is. And a scientific, it's an explanation, I guess, in general, not definition. It's rooted in the brain's reward system, dopamine. Then you have oxytocin, and that oxytocin is released during that reconciliation. Okay. Reward system, dopamine. Yay. Exciting. You buy something on Amazon. Oh, exciting. You get that special dessert. Exciting. You go gambling. Exciting, right? Dopamine, dopamine, dopamine. And then oxytocin is like the bonding chemical. And then that's this push and pull and everything happening. And it's a push-pull dynamic. And that reinforces attachment through unpredictability. And that creates the feedback loop. right? So think of this, okay? Your brain, it's a push-pull dynamic, okay? Here, there. And that's reinforcing that attachment. And that's through the unpredictability, and that creates the feedback loop. Now, why does this happen? Oh, well, let's go back to that for a minute. So a lot of this isn't just a decision that you're making. Now, some of it is choice. Some of it is a choice to say, am I willing to break this? What am I willing to do? Yes, that is a choice. There are other sides of it they are the things that are happening in your brain. And I've said this to you before. The brain is extremely smart, but not always, because your brain believes what you tell it, and the brain believes how it's been wired into that habit loop. Okay, so it sounds silly, but think about, and I can only speak for myself and probably some of you, when I was a small child, with or without trauma, I had this idea that if I was afraid or if I felt threatened, if I took the sheet, just a bed sheet, and put it over my head, like, oh my God, I'm safe. Now, this is what I would have told my brain, and my brain believed this. You know what? You're safe under here. No, you're not. It's a sheet. But in my brain said, you are safe. Right? Which is good, bad, or indifferent. It doesn't matter. But my point is your brain believes what you tell it and how it's been wired. And that's why you have to go through the loop of this. And that's the scientific part of it. Now, the other side of that, like I said, is choice driven. Am I willing to let go of things and people who are not in my best interest? I don't have to love someone and take this positive, negative reinforcement. That's the push-pull. Why does this happen? There's biological factors. Again, let's go into the science of it. It's that intermittent reinforcement. It's the variable awards, affection after abuse. How many of you have gone through this? Okay, really, let's think about this. And again, yes, physical, but it's not always physical. It could be emotional. And somebody goes off on you, loses their mind. They have lost their marbles. And you are like, oh my God. And they got really nasty and they pointed out all of your insecurities and how you can't live without them. And you have to make them happy because it's your role and you're the kid. Okay. Now think about all that stress. Doesn't that feel stressful? And then tomorrow, hey, you know what? Maybe I'm sorry, maybe I'm not. Maybe they say it, maybe not. You know what? Hey, I'm really sorry I acted that way. I love you. You know what? I'm going to take you for a massage. Or what do you need? I love you. I'm snuggling with you. So this is that weird affection after the abuse. That's a variable in reward. So then you start chasing, again, dopamine. Yay, love myself. Highs, lows. Oh my God, what is happening? I feel unsafe. But you've had this relationship with this person. You're falling in love with hope for change, but you had this relationship and it's this need. There is a need for this. So this creates that biological loop. And then you have to remember that when you're strengthening these attachments, you're telling yourself that this is valid. You see this a lot in parental relationships. And here's the harsh reality. You've got to stop trying to make relationships work that are no longer serving your growth. And I don't care if it is an adult child, and I do not care if it is a parent. You have to be willing to understand this. Because the issue comes when now there is a child and you have put your happiness, let's say you're the adult here, you have put their responsibility for your mood and fixing your mood onto them. Now that goes into emotional labor, we'll talk about next week, but you're putting that upon them. So you have this idea that these people are supposed to be here because they are your child. Well, they're an adult, they have a life outside of you, but you may have become so trauma bonded within this person that you can't see past that. Then there's expectations. Now, the worst part is if you have a child, and we're talking about adult children, you have a child, let's say some other daughter. You have a daughter who is just as trauma bonded with the mom. This goes into enmeshment, right? Now, this is a thing. You don't want to get out of the relationship. You want it to be different. It is a constant push-pull. And of course, now there's also that hormonal response that I was talking to you about, oxytocin and dopamine. So you also have cortisol, which is your stress hormone. So if you've ever heard of like cortisol overload, it's you being constantly stressed. It's a little bit different than adrenaline fatigue, but it's similar. Okay, so you have the cortisol, and that's during the abuse. But then you have the oxytocin, and that's during the reconciliation. Okay, so think about these chemicals. Again, it's not all just related in, idea, because some of this is related within the biological aspect of it. And I think that's the part that you want to get very clear in. Now, trauma, repetition, compulsion. I want you to hear this. Trauma, repetition, compulsion. That is a subconscious. So remember, a lot of stuff isn't just in the forefront of your mind. It's a subconscious recreating familiar patterns of abuse from childhood in attempts to resolve them. Okay? I want to repeat that and then we'll unbox that. Subconscious recreating, okay, familiar patterns of abuse from childhood in an attempt to resolve them. Okay? That's mind. So that's your mind. And that mistakes pain from connection. Okay, so how often have you thought, man, that's painful, but you know what? I had that relationship, and man, mom was a complete nightmare, and it was bad and everything, but I did have that connection with her. So think about what's happening in your brain. So consciously, but subconsciously, you're creating a familiar pattern, and you're creating that familiar pattern in abuse in an attempt to resolve them. And that's where you go back in time and you're playing rumination. You're going back and you're replaying a scenario. You're trying to change the outcome. But even though it was trauma, they were still your people and you had a connection, but it was painful. You know what's interesting about that? And this just came up while I was talking to you. I didn't research it. It's just what I know. Is think of this as being in a relationship with someone. Okay, anybody. And you keep thinking that because you had this argument or because this person said that they were jealous or they acted as though they were jealous, you feel as though that's the connection. You feel as though, oh, they love me. No, no, but you're reinforcing that. Your mind reinforces reward, no reward, reward, no reward. And this goes on and on. So you're trying to reconcile that in your brain by going, okay, let me go back in time. Let me keep playing this childhood scenario over and over in my head. And then the problem is your mind is mistaking that pain with a connection. And you'll see that a lot when people struggle to be alone. People are like, well, I don't want to be by myself. Why not? Being alone is a great, great, great place of clarity. Not being distracted by social media, not constantly needing to go anywhere, not always around somebody is where you're going to get a connection. Now, a trauma bond can prevent a lot of that, not in a good way, by the way, prevents that because you're so bonded and you're taking on their stuff, again, emotional labor, but you're taking on that stuff and you're so enmeshed with each other that it's that feed loop. And it's not a great thing to be in. Now, how can you break free from something like that? Because you're like, my God, that's a lot. And before we talk about breaking free, I want to tell you the story that I was going to tell you. So I had a lot of abuse in my house, a lot of abuse. And again, fresh in my head because I've been writing about it. When I was born to older people. My mom was 44. My dad was 49. Yes, when I was born, I was a change of life baby. And that was 53 years ago. So it wasn't like, oh, older parents. No, it was like all this danger. And I mean, it's still not so great. And within that time, of course, I'm new. I'm new here, right? My mom had severe phobias, severe anxieties, severe depressions. My dad was in World War II. And he had PTSD. He also had a lot of, I wouldn't even say sociopathic. I would almost say psychopathic in a way, but it's the gray area. And an alcoholic and drinker, and that's him. And then I had a brother and sister. I have two sisters. One's left. And I have one brother and one sister who passed. And they were heavily into narcotics at that time because they were raised in like the 40s, right? Now, this is the 70s. So I'm born now, and this is what I'm coming into. Here I am. I'm here. So over a period of time, in between watching all of that with my siblings, watching my brother pull a gun on my dad and constantly threaten to kill him. And then my sister and my brother always, being in some form of a drug thing, and my sister trying to kill herself 3 times, and, my mom being sick, and my mom always feeling like she was going to die, which is where my health anxiety came into play, and death anxiety, is because she would have these panic attacks multiple times, and it would always be like, oh my God, I'm dying, right? So I had this constant trauma of hearing this multiple times a day. So of course it's a fear. That's probably one of the fears I probably battle more than any of the other ones, because it's always creeping up, because it was ingrained in my head and I was always on go. Well, after mom had passed, and I was early, I wasn't even 14 yet, close to 14, dealing with all of that with the siblings, and then all of the abuse of every way that I was experiencing with my dad, which, by the way, when he passed, I didn't have any anger towards him at all. And we can unbox that in a whole different podcast, but I'm a big forgiveness person. For me, I know there's a lot of things that say you don't have to forgive to move on. And that's whatever works for you. For me, I realized my dad was going through his own stuff. Not like, making excuses. My dad went through his own stuff, and it was miserable in his brain. Yes, I was on the receiving end of it, but I could take back the power of going, man, here you go. Like, I'm not carrying that with you. However, a trauma bond was there. So my brother and I, when I was born, brother's 26, my sister's 24. And, my brother's not so keen on having a little sister, because my brother was my mom's apple of his eye, and my sister too, but really him. So we didn't, there's a lot of jealousy. Again, not my problem. I'm new here. But as that time went on and everybody kind of knew what was happening with dad and I did not realize, my sister told me later, that it was my brother who called social services. My brother did. It's crazy, but I'm like, okay. I mean, he's been gone for a while, but we just never had I wanted it. I wanted the relationship, but I was the outcast, so to speak. Not so much with my sister, but side note, she had a lot of stuff. And social services came. At the time, we were going to get out of this apartment. Our house was infested with well over 500 mice in the walls that would come out. It just was, it just was. And so there was a lot going on, then stuff that was going on at home, and then that. And it was a little bit inhabitable-ish, but then I became friends with them. It was just weird. It's just how my brain worked, because, you surround yourself in settings, and you just adapt. I'm an adaptable creature, because so are you. And I remember when they came to the house, and they set me down to talk to me. Now, they didn't, because I was younger, they didn't isolate me from my dad. I can to this day remember I'm sitting on the couch. Somebody comes in, sits down, and is pretty much, I wasn't afraid. Okay, so it wasn't like dad was intimidating me by being there. I wasn't afraid that he was going to get mad. I really wasn't. Strange, but I wasn't. And they asked me a bunch of questions, and I remembered feeling, in so many words, they're like, all right, do you want us to take you? Okay, is it time to go? Or do you feel unsafe? They didn't ask it that way. And part of me was like, yeah. And then the other part of me was like, no, this is my dad. I was trauma bonded to my father for years, trauma bonded, because my dad would do the, abuse and then reward system, right? Abuse and the reward system. And then when you're so hungry, because my mom had passed, I was kind of swirling out of control, dealing with my own mental problems and my ADHD. And of course, you're not allowed to have ADHD. You just got to sit down. Like, there was all of these rules. And even though it was unhealthy, of course, I'm 53. I can look back on that, and go, well, that was unhealthy. Why the hell didn't you get out? You don't think of that in a trauma bond. You don't make decisions based on what's better for you. You're making decisions based on the trauma that you have with said person and the fact that you don't want to be away from them. Constant push-pull. So I remember that to this day. And I don't look and go, I wish I would have left, or none of those things. But when I was doing some writing in the book, I was like, my God, that was a trauma bond. And in many ways, it was both ways, because dad solely relied on me for a lot of things. I relied on him. It was this very unhealthy cycle. When things were good, they were good. When they weren't, they were not. but there was a constant back and forth. And, and then again, there's this isolation. And I remember Dad telling me early on, there's something wrong with you. You're cuckoo. There's something wrong with you. You're cuckoo. And I knew I had something, but I already felt weird because I'm very intuitive. I've been able to see passed away people. I have a bunch of things, and then I have the anxiety and I have these things. So to hear somebody say I'm cuckoo, I already feel like I'm crazy. So the fact that somebody can tolerate my crazy made me good. I can see this. So you have to remember trauma bonds are going to come. Now, it may not be as violent as that for you. It doesn't have to be over the top like that. But if you're falling in love with hope of an idea of what somebody is supposed to represent, that trauma bond is going to be there because you keep bonding, you keep waiting, and then you see glimmers of hope. And again, it just goes back and forth, and it just becomes this loop. So going back to now, what I was saying is breaking free from those trauma bonds is you got to understand from the beginning. You got to understand the cycle. You got to recognize the patterns of abuse and reconciliation. And again, I want to be careful when I say abuse, only because a lot of times people go straight to physical abuse, but it can be being constantly guilt tripped. It could be you're guilt tripped and then you play nice and then you get the reward and it's okay and you feel good and you feel valued. And then if you don't do it, then you're punished. I'm punished. And then you go back to this. It just becomes this big issue. So when you can look, so think about this right now. Okay. Pause it, think about it, come back to this. Is what relationships right now, do you feel you get that back and forth? The abuse, and we're going to use that in every form, and then the reconciliation. Do you see, now this goes a little bit different. Are you falling in love with hope from change for the relationship you're going to have with your mom? And then you see a little change, you get all excited, and then it's not there. And then you're like, damn. And then you go back to this and you're doing these constant cycles. Well, then you know what's happening here. Because remember, awareness is always going to be your first step, always. Take trauma bonding out for a minute. If you are aware that if you look at every scenario and you go, wow, I'm a common denominator here. I'm aware of this. I'm not going to judge it. What steps do I need to do and take to make this different, right? Awareness. To be aware and to be honest with yourself is already 75 steps ahead of where so many people are because they want it to be everything else, So how do you rebuild your self-worth? Because in a trauma bond, you don't have value outside of said person or people or work. Because again, you can have this with work. You can have this within your friendships. It's not exclusive to romantic or parental relationships, right? It doesn't always have to be familial. Obviously, we have direction. Like, I have my clients, so I help you rewire it. There's reasons therapy exists. There's reasons that you're reframing, and you might not have the tools to do that on your own. One of the biggest issues people have is, I can do this by myself. You cannot, okay? You can do some things. You do have to do the work. You are 10,000% responsible for solely doing your work, but you can't sit there and try to figure it out. While you're in a trauma bond, you're going to suddenly listen to this podcast, listen to Mel's podcast, listen to Jay's podcast, get 54 books, and you're going to do those things. And you're looking for that answer that says, this is what you need to do. And trauma bond's going to be broken. All of us can only give you the roadmap. All of us can only give you the knowledge that you may not have had. All of us can only give you the tools, but you have to take those tools and you have to turn those tools. Is it scary? Yes. Does that mean that you might not have family around you? Yes, but that's not bad. See, that's not bad. You don't want to have toxic people and people who you're trauma bonded with, or the other way around, right? Because sometimes it's not just you and them. Sometimes it's them and you're like, oh my. And then you go through your own attachments and it's very much a clusterfuck. It really is. So you have to be willing to do it, but you can't do it by just saying that you listened to something and it sounded great and you had an aha moment, but then you're not taking action to it. So you can't always do that by yourself. Maybe you need medication to help while you're doing it. You can't necessarily avoid medicine if maybe that's what you need, either long-term or even just temporary. Doesn't mean you have to have it, but you got to be open to it. Because what that does is it's going to rewire what I help you do, and what many help you do is to rewire those negative beliefs of your self-worth in those relationships. Because you can't see your self-worth because you've adopted your self-worth to said person. So now you're bonded to this person based on how they see you, based on what they tell you about yourself, based on the value in which they have determined what you can get, based on the obligations that they want you to have towards them. And I mean, that's just it. Now you got to build a life outside of the relationship, hobbies, friendships, financial independence. You have got to build a life outside of these people. One of the hardest things, and you see a lot of it when, and this kind of goes into attachment and some trauma bonding, but really attachments here, is if a person, right? My daughter is going to be 18. She's in college. My son's 20, almost 29. He's been out for years. I always made sure I had a life outside of these people. My husband, my kids. I have to have a life outside of them. Let's say I didn't. Let's say my sole purpose was just be a parent, be there, don't have a life outside of them, be there. Okay. Now they're 17, they're 19, they've moved on with their life. They're living their best life. Well, now I'm trauma bonded. So now I'm going to feel some kind of way when they don't come to my house for dinner. If they do not call me, I'm going to feel that way because I'm now bonded to these people because my whole life revolved around them. That's where emptiness syndrome comes in. I mean, when it's intense, anything's a change, right? But where it really comes in hard is when you've put your value into the people. That creates a whole bunch of attachment. But very often, if there was something else going on in the house, it's something familiar that you guys both witnessed and experienced together. That's going to create something that you're like, well, you understand me and I understand you. And then there's all these other things and it becomes a bond, but it can be traumatic. So good, bad, and different, there's always those gray areas for various situations, but you want to be careful. And when you're aware of it, you got to build a life outside of family, outside of your work, outside of your friendships. And in order to do that, you have to be willing to be with yourself. You're okay. You can do this. You're listening to this, right? You're hearing this. Well, you're listening to it because you would like to make a change, I would assume. Or maybe you stumbled upon it. You're like, well, what's she talking about? And you're like, oh, well, maybe that makes sense. Maybe it resonates. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe this episode doesn't. Maybe some others do. But as long as you're getting something, but then you're saying, does this affect me? Is this me? You want to break it, but you got to be willing to do the work. And it is going to be hard. And it is going to seem hopeful. When you get off here, you're like, yes, I'm going to break these trauma bonds. And it's going to sound beautiful for the first 2 days. And you're going to do the worksheet. And you're going to go, I'm ready. And you're going to be until your trauma bond goes, oh, yeah, but remember, you got to be patient with yourself. Do not back down, though, when it rears its ugly head. You got to have a support system. You got to have a support system. And it doesn't always have to be friends. It doesn't always have to be family. I mean, yeah, therapy is great. That's a great support system. You can, like I said, if you get involved with a hobby, let's say you crochet like me. Maybe you're in a crochet club and you have that support. You have the support not to dump. You want to be careful of emotional dumping, but to have something and someone who doesn't need anything from you. They are not putting their value upon you and you don't feel that for them. No, you might have a better pattern, but that's a good relationship. So you got to have a life outside of these people, and because isolation is isolation if someone puts you there and then they fill that trauma bond and now you're their person because you're their everything and vice versa. Boundaries and no contact. This is my favorite freaking thing to talk about. Boundaries and going no contact. That's going to reduce the emotional and physical dependency. You have to allow yourself to be uncomfortable. You have to allow yourself to feel lost. You have to allow yourself to feel scared. You have to allow yourself to do that because sometimes you need to go no contact with either the person you have the bond to or the person that they have the bond towards you. Either or. You've got to do that because this will help you release that. In the beginning, it's going to be scary. In the beginning, you're going to be like, oh my God, I feel like my life is nothing without them. Or what am I going to do without my mom? And this is my role. And this is what we owe each other. And, we're mother and daughter. And the issue comes because mom is sharing so much and you're dumping all that and you're relying upon the kid to make you feel better and be that person to see you, and vice versa. So you have to understand that sometimes you have to go no contact in best for both of you, even if it's temporary, but you need a minute. That's where you got to ask yourself today, right now, as you're listening to this in the 35-minute mark of this, is, am I willing to be uncomfortable, to distance from a bond that has been problematic on my side or their side? You really got to ask yourself that question. And again, go back to what I said before. Don't fall in love with hope for change. And don't go into this appealing to duty thing where it's like, well, that's my mom, I just got it, or that's my kitten. No. That is appealing to duty, and that is not what we're going to do. Now, this is my favorite part. No, they all are, but this is my favorite part, is healing your root cause. See, the issue is, and this is what I tell every client and every person who I ever come in contact with, I want you to look at a big tree. Okay, just think of a tree. You got the root, you have all of that, right? But you have all these leaves up top, little branches and leaves. The problem and the issue that people have is they're not looking at the root. They're worried about their marriage. They're worried about this. They're worried about all these things, and they want to fix all these things and their anxieties. And okay, because you're looking at the leaves. The leaves don't mean a damn thing without the roots feeding the leaves. So if you are thinking, I'm going to talk to Lori about my marital problems, that's great. And we will. And I'll give you helpful tips. But we're not going to stay at the marriage. We're going to go with why you feel the need to stay in it. Well, that's going to be down here in the root. See, the problem is people want to address the leaves, but you don't want to address the root. Healing the root, knowing what attachment wounds you have, working on developing secure attachment, my favorite thing to teach, working on that. Going through mindfulness, self-compassion, healthier relationships. But you can't have a healthy relationship until you have a healthy one with yourself, because then you're going to go from a trauma bond into attachments and expectations over here. So you want to be careful of changing one trauma bond into an attachment and possibly another trauma bond. That's important. So you're worried about the instant gratification, the things that you're dealing with today. These are the things that you're concerned with, and that's fine. And those are things that are real in your life today, but you gotta go to the root. And that's where it all works. My favorite thing that I will tell you, that I tell all new people that come to me personally, is I will trigger you. Oh, well, why would she do that? Because triggering you is me bringing your inner child to the table. We've talked about this before, bringing the little you, the trauma bonded you, bringing them to the table and setting them in front of you and saying, you need to address this with her or him or them. This is who you need to address it with. So yes, I am going to do something that's going to create discomfort, that is going to give you a sense of a trigger, because that trigger is just your inner child and different versions of you that just want to be heard. So they're going to keep resurfacing, and the more you avoid them is the more that you're not going to address them, and you're going to neglect them because it's uncomfortable. So it's got to be in your face because you deserve that. Not you deserve to be negative. That's not what I'm saying. You deserve to be able to address that inner child. You deserve to be able to help heal that child. And yes, it's going to be uncomfortable. And yes, that's how it's supposed to be. But that is how you're going to do it. It's how you're going to form healthy relationships. That's how you're going to get through things. That's how you're going to finally accept that relationship with your mom may not be the best one and may not be one to have at all. You're going to have to accept that, you know what? Maybe this job isn't for me, even though I wanted to do it forever. Maybe the relationship and my spouse, maybe they're not it for me. But are you willing to take those steps? Now, there's scientific evidence in recovery because of your brain plasticity, as I was telling you earlier with neuroplasticity. You have to unlearn attachments and develop healthier neural pathways through consistent, effortable steps and going no contact. This is how you rewire your brain. You are capable, but you've got to be consistent. You've got to be consistent, and you will develop healthier neural pathways when you're unlearning your attachments. That is not fast. That is not fast. That takes repetition. That takes forward steps, backward steps, forward steps, backward steps. This is how it's going to help you. This is how you overwrite those patterns. It's how you overwrite them. And it reduces your psychological stress on so many levels. You got to acknowledge that breaking a trauma bond is hard, but it is possible. It is so possible. You have to emphasize in yourself that healing is a process and not an overnight solution. All of us who have issues with patience just loves things and sentences like, hey, you have to be patient. Hey, you have to do that. We just love that. But you know what? There's no fast fixes. Now, there's psychological factors. Childhood attachment wounds, we've just discussed those. Most of this is happening during childhood. However, it can kick in other times. And any insecure attachment, anxious, avoidant, or disorganized, which is both, anything other than secure attachment, is going to make it more, it's going to make individuals in general more vulnerable to trauma bonds. Okay, so there's never, let's just address the trauma bond and then boom. They're not exclusively alone. Everything is connected. So you have this umbrella. Let's say it's anxiety, stress, mental health, whatever. You have that umbrella. Then you have all these little bits that go into everything. If you listen to all 216 episodes of this podcast, they are all going to be connected. Every single one will have a variable and a connection to another one. Anywhere. Because there's only so many ways to heal, and there's only so many ways to empower yourself, and there's only so many ways to provide you with self-worth. I can't reinvent the wheel, but I can reinvent the way that I'm delivering this information to you. So that's why there's over 200 episodes. There's going to be a pretty common underlier of about 5 to 6 things. But sometimes you have to address it in different ways for people to hear it. And that's fine. That's how life works. But you have to work on what the deeper rooted issue is. And if you had early exposure to inconsistent caregivers, right? Well, that creates an entire template of tolerating toxic relationships because they're inconsistent. Again, risk reward, abuse, reconciliation, abuse, reconciliation. Maybe you have that. Well, of course, what else are you going to do? Of course, you're going to develop a trauma bond. Then you have the cognitive dissonance, which, by the way, has its entire own podcast. Go listen to it. It's way back. It's in the hundreds somewhere. And victims try to justify and minimize abuse to reconcile conflicting feelings of love and harm, right? So think of dissonance in a different way. Think of it as like, this is my goal. Am I living accordingly to that? So you have a goal, but you're living differently. And then you're trying to reconcile that within your brain on how that's working and why that's working. So it's the same thing because you feel powerless to leave due to repeated cycles of failure when trying to assert yourself. Because remember, there is that certain space of that learned helplessness that comes into play. And if you're worried about what everybody is thinking and you have that self-blame, because there's a level of self-blame that comes with all of this. There's a level of self-blame that you think is your fault. This is your fault. Somehow or another, this bond is your fault. If you don't show up for them this way, it's your fault. If you don't do this, and these are the people that I need because this person shows me value, but I'm attached to them because this makes me feel good because I'm bouncing from, the abuse part of it to the reward part of it to they see me, they're talking to me, they're having popcorn with me. Those are the simple things that I want. Because you're looking at them to try to fill that void that we didn't even know that we had. And that creates this horrendous bond. And it's really, if you think about it, trauma bond. Trauma, not great. Bond seems like it should be great, right? That alone is confusing, right? Trauma, bond. Okay, so trauma, that's not great. Bond, that seems like it's good. So seriously, think about how the words are even there. So the whole definition of it explains it all in one sentence. So if you're looking at it from the fear of abandonment, from the shame, from the denial because you're in hope for change. And the other side of that, and I talked about it briefly, was a bond that someone else has, but you don't feel that you're in the trauma bond. You're just there. You're like, this is great. But someone else has attached this bond to you that they've created this trauma bond, but you don't even realize you're part of the game. But then it just gets weird for everybody. So typically you're going to find a trauma bond between two people, but there's an idea that says, if I love this person, I'm attached, which is essentially attachment, right? A one-sided trauma bond is attachment. That's why if you have and so a good example of that would be anxious attachment versus avoidant attachment. That's essentially one person is trauma bonded. The other person is like, what the hell is happening here? And that's the whole idea behind it. And it's going to take work, but it's going to be you who is the root. You are the person who has got to realize over a period of time, because it's not going to happen fast, is these relationships and these situations that we're in, that we feel trapped in, that we feel a victim of imprisonment to. And a lot of times we didn't realize that that's what's happening. So we keep chasing this solidity of who we are. And it's just a very frustrating process. But I want you to know that those are not healthy relationships. Nothing about that is a healthy relationship at all. And I don't want you to think that control, that I need you to do this, and that I'm going to treat you poorly, and then I'm going to let you know how much I love you. That is not love. That is not love. If you're in a parental and a child relationship, and one is trying to hold grandkids against somebody, and the other one thinks, well, you're my kid, you're supposed to do this. Or you're my parent, you're supposed to do this. Obviously, as adults, this is a problem. Because the expectations are, you can make me feel whole. And then if you show a glimmer of that, now we start that cycle. So trauma bonds are very real. Trauma bonds go hand in hand with attachment. There are ways to get through it. This is not a life sentence. You do not have to stay in a trauma bond, but you do have to be the one willing to take on the fact that it's going to be you doing this solo move. It may be disruptive to some people, but that cannot be your focus. You focus long enough of trying to solve their emotional issues and expecting them to do that too. And the beautiful thing is that this is in your control. You can do this. Yes, you can. Yep. I understand you want it to be different, but it isn't. And you got to radically accept that some relationships are just not meant to be long-term, season, reason, lifetime. We just did that. And that's so important, because just because you want it doesn't mean it's healthy for you. So I want you to really think on that. I want you to really understand that these are not good, healthy relationships, but there's a reason why they exist. So once you can see it on paper, you don't feel as alone. You don't feel as trapped. But you do have to remember that this is something that isn't healthy for you, and you don't have to continue it. But you do have to be ready and willing to let relationships go that you've fallen deeply in love with hope for change.